Following the James English podcast, Did Luke Mitchell Kill Jodi Jones? There have been hundreds of comments on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, newspaper websites, and inevitably a number of questions have come up. The interview with James was only an hour long. This case spans 16 years, so there was no way we were going to be able to cover everything in just that one interview. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to answer some of the questions that have popped up on the various sites. I printed them off, they're in no particular order except for two, which I've kept for the end because they raise a question for me as well. So I'll just go through them and answer them as best I can. First thought going through my mind when watching this was that Sandra couldn't mind an awful lot. She was very, very forgetful of what things were said and what were not, and was very cagey on some answers. I forgot the third question in each of Luke and Corinne's lie detector tests. For that, I apologise. I have a huge amount of information that I carry around in my head about this case, and there will be times where I can't bring an answer to mind immediately. I did rectify that. I've put links to the lie detector tests themselves in the comment section on the James English interview, so if anybody would like to know what that was all about, you can go and check them out there. Why did his mother burn his clothes? It wasn't his mother, it was his brother who burned them. Nobody burned his clothes. Luke was taken straight to the police station from where Jodie's body was found and held there till 7 o'clock the following morning with his mum. A liaison officer was appointed to the family that day and was with them from then pretty much to the 13th of August. The first police raid was on the 4th of July. They forensically checked the log burner in the garden, they took away the ashes and forensically checked them, and they turned up nothing. No evidence whatsoever of any clothing having been burnt there. There was no opportunity for anybody to dispose of ash because, as I said, they were in the police station all night, and then the liaison officer was there every day after that. And also, from day one, the media were camped out practically in their garden, so their every move was being watched. There was, however, a story about the mother of a suspect burning clothes in a back garden on the night of the murder. But that mother wasn't Corrie Mitchell, and that suspect wasn't Luke. This was a house in Newton Grange, which is a village that borders East Houses at the opposite end of the path to Newbattle, where Luke lived. We now know that there was only ever one suspect, so the best that can be said about this story that turned up at the time is that somebody was burning clothing in a back garden the night of the murder. The police went and had a word with them, and then somehow that story got transferred over onto the Mitchell family. The police had it in for Luke from day one. Whether he did it or not, I have no idea. I remember there was something in the press about him calling a talking clock to find out the time. Never got touched upon in the interview. That's right. On the afternoon of June 30th, Luke called the speaking clock from his mobile phone at 4:54 to be precise. The police later claimed that that proved he was out of the house because he was using his mobile phone. There was evidence, quite a bit of evidence, that Luke regularly called the speaking clock from his mobile phone when he was at home. On that particular day, his brother was on the internet. It was back in dial-up internet days, so he couldn't have used the landline if he wanted to because his brother was on the internet. But what's interesting about this claim that the call to the speaking clock proved that Luke was out of the house is at exactly the time that call was being made. It was also being claimed Luke was the person being seen with Jodi at the East House's end of the path. The eyewitness didn't say that initially, that developed eventually till she said it was Jodi and Luke that she saw. But her descriptions never ever mentioned a mobile phone. Now she was quite clear, the guy was standing with his hands out to the sides, palms facing forward, the whole time. The police, on the one hand, are claiming that Luke calling the speaking clock at 4:54 p.m. proved he was out the house. But at the same time, that he's the guy at the East House's end of the path being seen with no phone. It doesn't end there. The police never got cell site analysis of anybody's phones. And I've always wondered why. The sighting at the East House's end of the path was very weak. It was very precarious. If they'd had cell site data that proved Luke's mobile phone went from New Battle to East Houses and back again that evening at that precise time, it would have been really, really strong evidence to support their contention that the person seen at the East House's end of the path was Luke. But they didn't do it. The defence tried to get legal aid funding to have the cell site analysis done. Back then, it was believed that cell site data was only kept for a year, and Luke didn't even have a defence team until April 2004, which was nearly 10 months after the murder. When the defence team applied for legal aid funding, the Legal Aid Board came back and said that the expert that they'd chosen was too expensive and they'd have to go find somebody else. We can only presume from the case papers that by then they'd run out of time to get the data because it was only stored for a year. So the cell site analysis, the movement of phones, anybody's phones that night, was never done. And I cannot believe the police didn't do it. It would have been such strong evidence and they didn't do it. It makes no sense. Oh yeah, this was, a couple of the newspapers ran stories after the James English interview, and one of them had a quote from a police officer that said, "Extensive forensic analysis was carried out along with door-to-door inquiries and other investigative techniques, and a full report of the circumstances was submitted to the Procurator Fiscal." Extensive forensic analysis. If this was the basis of the report to the Procurator Fiscal and the basis of their case, why was Luke Mitchell even a suspect? There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene or the crime scene to him. How easy would it be to get someone in prison a lie detector test? I know this woman says it took a year in this case. Have there been other cases of prisoners being allowed to have one? Back then it was actually relatively easy to have lie detectors done in prisons, and there have been quite a few done. It was a bit more difficult with Luke's case simply because it was such a high profile case. After we put the footage of Luke's test on YouTube, there was a clampdown on lie detectors in Scottish prisons. The rules were changed so that only prisoners with active proceedings could have a lie detector done. And my question is why? They're not allowed as evidence. So what difference does it make whether people have active proceedings or not? The way I read it, it's just another attempt to close these conversations down, to take the voices away, so that the fight to have questionable or wrongful convictions re-examined just becomes even harder. If Luke's DNA wasn't there, then why would the cops ignore the real evidence? Well, there was so much damage done at the beginning of the investigation. They let the other three searchers go and mingle with other family members. They didn't take their clothing, they didn't take their mobile phones, they didn't even take their statements while Luke was taken off to the police station for questioning. They'd contaminated the crime scene. They did all sorts of things that they shouldn't have done and didn't do things they should have done in that first 2 weeks. So when the DNA results came back and there was nothing of Luke there, it was too late. Anything they'd lost in that first 2 weeks was gone forever. A lot of things happened that shouldn't have to this guy. Firstly, he was 14 and refused a lawyer or parent guardian and questioned. This should have collapsed there. Then he's plastered all over the media and under 18. That's absolutely true. Back in 2003, what were known as Section 14 interviews were allowed in Scotland. They were legal. And that meant the police could take anybody in for questioning and hold them for 6 hours without legal advice or representation. Now, a lot of people have said, why would you need legal advice or representation if you've done nothing wrong? And this case is the absolute best example of why. When the case got to appeal in 2008, the appeal court judges said the behaviour of those police officers in that Section 14 interview, the second interview, was outrageous and to be deplored, that the officers had lost it. Having decided that, they also decided there was no miscarriage of justice because Luke didn't confess. So they treated him so badly, they'd broken all their own rules. The appeal judges agreed with that. But because they couldn't break Luke, because he would not confess to something he hadn't done, the appeal court judges said, well, nothing wrong here, and upheld the conviction. That's the sort of thing we've been up against for the last 16 years. What I can't get my head around, how Luke had the know-how to clean up his tracks and leave no trace. I think this is strange and suspicious, the fact Luke was only a young lad who turns out to be a lot cleverer than top forensics and top police crime scene investigators. Yeah, I find it quite suspicious as well, because it's not just the crime scene. It's his home, his mum's car, his bikes, his dad's home, every item of clothing he possessed. Everywhere he would have been that night, everywhere he would have gone. Not a trace of the murder left anywhere. So it's not just the crime scene, it's everything else as well. Nothing ever found to link him to the murder. There is definitely major doubt in this case. I wonder though, Luke was represented by one of Scotland's top QCs in Donald Findlay. If the case was so flimsy against Luke, then surely Findlay could have torn it to shreds. Either this case against Luke was stronger than believed, or Donald Findlay has been a total failure for justice. You would expect a top lawyer to destroy it. The jury can only convict if it's a case beyond all reasonable doubt. Well, that's a myth for a start. It's very easy to convince people beyond reasonable doubt if you only tell them half the story. If you don't give them anything to counter the story you're telling them, then you can make it appear that there is no doubt. It was a trial by media, essentially. So the media had done the prosecution's job for them for months before the case came to trial. So I don't think it would have mattered who represented Luke because of the negative coverage. I think Donald Findlay came at this case from the old school perspective that it's for the prosecution to prove guilt and not for the defence to prove innocence, which is exactly as it should be. But in this day and age, that approach doesn't stand a chance, not with the amount of media coverage there was in the run-up to this case. Forget the doubt that Sandra's putting in your head. That's what Luke and his mum have done to her over 13 years. She brought up doubts by mention of the sister's boyfriend and then, brackets, alibi. Oh no, he didn't. He didn't have an alibi for the first 12 days of the investigation. Luke's mum and his brother were accused of lying to cover up for him because 2 days in, Luke's mum reminded his brother what they'd had for dinner that night, and she had reason to remember because Luke had burnt the dinner. These people, exactly the same circumstances, these people remembered 12 days into the investigation that they'd been eating dinner with this particular family member and remembered exactly what they'd eaten. And that's what gave him his alibi. But it wasn't considered suspicious that they suddenly remembered 12 days in what they were eating, even though there was nothing untoward about what they ate to remind them. But Luke's mum and his brother were considered suspicious for remembering 2 days in. That's the first thing. There were other people whose alibis were given to them by one other family member at some point later into the investigation. But again, that wasn't considered suspicious. It was only considered suspicious when it applied to the Mitchell family. The condom, nothing to do with that crime, and the DNA didn't match with any of the DNA from Jodi. Well, we don't know. We don't know if it had anything to do with the crime, because the police messed up the swabbing of the outside of the condom. So we don't know whose DNA it might have matched. When the DNA on that condom, in that condom, came back and it wasn't Luke's, they did everything in their power to distance the condom from the crime. So for example, when it was found, it was registered as being found 20 yards from the body. That was then changed to a 20-yard radius of the body. And finally, a 50-yard radius from the body. So again, the question is why? Why was that not a significant piece of evidence, if not at that point the most significant piece of evidence they'd uncovered? I don't know how many people watching this would think a condom, a freshly filled condom, deposited that close to the body on the night of the murder is insignificant, but that's what we've got. Luke's alibi was given to him by his mum, yeah, but as I've said, other people were given their alibi by only one other person as well. Luke also left school at lunchtime about 1 p.m, went home, got psyched up, was not seen with Jodi when she came home or left again. Luke was in school all day. This version where Luke somehow sneaked off and lay in wait for Jodi, aside from the fact that it's not supported by the evidence, it contradicts what eventually became the prosecution's story, that Jodi was grounded that night right up until 4:30. What would be the point of Luke lying in wait for somebody who wasn't allowed out? If Jodi was stripped, sexually attacked, then murdered, the condom would have been the perfect get out of jail free card. For Luke, yes, it would have been. Something I want to point out here. If Jodi was stripped, sexually attacked, then murdered, that's not the order the prosecution claims the attack on Jodi happened in. They claim she was murdered first, then stripped and had her hands tied behind her back with her own trousers. But yeah, it would have been a get out of jail free card for Luke had they not messed up the swabbing and had they not distanced it so much from the investigation in the first place. This is Jodi's sister's then boyfriend. Sandra Lean, trying to keep herself relevant again. Lost count how many other people she has tried to blame this on, me included. I've never tried to blame anybody, because to do that would be to do to them what was done to Luke Mitchell. What I have said over and over and over again in the last almost 16 years is that this investigation should have gone so much further on so many counts, and it didn't, purely because they were so convinced Luke was Jodi's murderer that they didn't follow up on other information. In any normal investigation, you would look at this stuff and say, these questions need to be answered. We need to know the circumstances surrounding this. They didn't do it. As for making me relevant, I'm not relevant to any of this. I'm the messenger, that's it. Has time passed and you forgot Jodi and her family? No. No, not one day. I do this as much for Jodi's family as I do for Luke's, because neither of them have had justice. And I know Jodi's family have been convinced that Luke was the murderer and the case is proven beyond reasonable doubt. I've put out all the information that I've ever been able to find about the case and the investigation, I leave it up to other people to decide for themselves if they believe that's actually the case. Why was a 14-year-old boy stripped, no lawyer and clothes taken away, and not one of the other search party that found her that night got the same treatment? Again, absolutely true. They took Luke straight to the police station, stripped him and put him in a paper suit. There were no responsible adults there. His mum was on her way. They didn't even wait for her. That gives you an indication of how convinced they were from the off that Luke was their man. The police doctor was called in ostensibly to look him over for scratches, fresh injuries, that sort of thing. But there were to be no invasive tests. It was just a visual check for anything that might link him to the crime. They did end up taking blood and DNA and all sorts. And Luke didn't object to that. He and the family assumed that would have to be done in order to eliminate him. But the fact is, he was a 14-year-old kid who'd just been taken straight from finding the body of his girlfriend. He shouldn't have been in a position to have to make decisions like that. They were quick to bring in a doctor to check him over for fresh injuries that might link him to the crime. Not once was he offered any sort of psychological assessment or emotional assistance. He was just an object to be connected to the crime. That's all they saw him as. Listen to how she explains the finding of Jodi's body. Luke said, "I'll walk up the path that she would have used, walked right past the body, then on the way back down, the dog alerts them and Luke finds her first." That's the moment he didn't want to miss, the finding of the body, like arsonists and their fire. This has come up a few times, the question of why the dog didn't alert on the way up the path. And Luke said from the very beginning, she may well have done. She was a very excitable dog, and here she was getting an extra unexpected walk late at night. She was bouncing around all over the place. And Luke said, if she jumped at the wall or jumped at the field or jumped at anything, he would just have pulled her away. Because his mission, while he was on his own, was to get up the path looking for Jodi, and if he didn't find her, to go to her mum's house where the grown-ups would decide what to do next. It was only when the search trio suggested walking back down that Luke thought to put the dog in tracker mode, because she was training to be a tracker dog. And now he was watching the dog, he was looking for alerts. But as for that's the moment he didn't want to miss, there is no way he could have known the search trio would be waiting for him at the top of the path. There's no way he could have known they would suggest a double check. Because when he first set out, he was the only searcher. The others didn't leave for another 15-20 minutes after Luke left. So he didn't know they were going to be there. They didn't know he was going to be there. So how could he be setting up this idea of being there when the body was found, when he didn't even know they were going to be there and he didn't know they were going to suggest a double check? I remember they found a bit of hash in his bedroom. At his sentencing, his reports claimed cannabis was an evil drug which made him hear voices and made him kill her. If the investigators genuinely believed that cannabis could make somebody do what was done to Jodi, the question then becomes, why did they not look at people with access to far higher quantities of cannabis than Luke had? The two boys on the moped at the wall that afternoon, one of them supplied the whole group with cannabis. So Luke used cannabis, Jodi used cannabis, all of the friends used cannabis, a number of Jodi's family used cannabis, and this guy supplied them all. They didn't look at what cannabis might have been responsible in relation to him. What didn't come out at trial, and we only found out about it when we got the case papers, was that Jodi's brother had a 9-bar on him that afternoon, which the police eventually found out about. I don't know if they ever recovered it, but they eventually found out about it. And they had no concerns about that amount of cannabis having any sort of ill effects. So once again, the claim that it was cannabis that made Luke do what he did to Jodi, which is the prosecution case, they didn't even consider that cannabis might be a factor in anybody else that might have had a reason to harm Jodi. Jodi's people need to come forward and tell us in what light did they see Luke. What character was Luke in Jodi's family's eyes? Well, that's problematic now. Back then, in their statements, they all said he was a nice lad, quiet, polite, dead laid back. Jodi was really happy that he was her boyfriend, and he seemed to be a nice lad. That's what all of them had to say in their statements at the beginning. But they've been convinced over the years that actually he was a monster in disguise as a nice lad. So asking them now would be completely counterproductive. What's on Luke's medical records? Was he taking any psychotic controlling medication or anything? Well, there's nothing on Luke's medical records. Nothing. If the question of psychosis or antipsychotic medication is something that should have formed part of the investigation, then there was somebody very close to Jodi who suffered from quite extreme psychosis and was on the highest dose of antipsychotic medication, which wasn't working because he was continuing to use recreational drugs that were interfering with that medication. That person wasn't Luke, nor was he ever a suspect. So if, as this question appears to be suggesting, psychosis and medication to control it should have been part of the investigation, then there was somebody that fitted those circumstances perfectly, who was never looked at. Interesting to me because I went to the school where this happened with Sandra's daughters and have met Luke and his mum at the caravan site. Similar to the Avery case, I think they have the right man, but the investigation was messed up. To be honest, one of the reasons the police and public believed that Luke was the killer is because he was a goth into metal who looked a bit weird. The actual evidence seems to be slim. That was going so well until we got to the bit about the police and public believed he was a killer because he was a goth into metal and looked a bit weird. Now, bear in mind, this is from somebody who claims to have known him at the time. Does this picture look like a goth to you? What about this one? No? That's what it looked like at the time. You've just watched an interview with a lady who is dedicated to proving that Mitchell is innocent. It's no surprise that she only provides information that would cast doubt on his guilt. I've provided information on everything, because this is not just about whether Luke Mitchell is innocent or guilty. This is about the process by which we are supposedly doing justice in this country. What was allowed to pass as an investigation? What was allowed to pass as fair treatment by the media? What was allowed to pass as a fair trial? And we've all been hoodwinked by the mainstream media version of this case. So all I've done is taken everything that would have countered the media representation had it actually been printed at the time, and I've put it out there for people to make up their own minds. We have not seen the full facts. Does anybody really believe that mainstream media has been printing the full facts about this case for the last decade and a half? That's exactly my point. You do need the full facts. And since 2003, nobody's had them. Now, anybody that's interested can go back, look at all the mainstream stuff. They can look at the court documents. And if they feel so inclined, they can go look at what's in the book. and see for themselves what information stands up to scrutiny and what doesn't. That way, you are getting all the information, or at least as much of it as it's humanly possible to put out there right now. The lady in the interview has a motive to make you think there was no case to answer. No, the lady in the interview is saying, go check it out for yourself, make up your own mind. If he thinks he was misrepresented, he can complain to the Law Society. All you speak of, or what was known at the time, would have been heard at his appeal. What went wrong? Where do I begin with what went wrong? First of all, a complaint to the Law Society is a complete waste of time. And anybody in these circumstances will tell you that. Secondly, this idea that you can somehow just take a whole bunch of stuff and throw it at the appeal court judges and they'll accept it all. It is a complete misunderstanding. They don't. New evidence for an appeal is that which was not or could not reasonably have been known at the time of the original trial. Much of what we're talking about today wasn't even discovered until after Luke's appeal in 2008. And how can you put something before the appeal court that you don't know about? How can Donald Findlay defend against something he doesn't know about? There's been a huge amount in the papers recently about disclosure failings. That's hiding evidence to the rest of us. If the police don't disclose evidence, or worse still, if they don't gather it in the first place so that there's nothing to disclose, how can a defence defend? How can any appeal be built in those circumstances? I know a policeman who worked on the case. He was from the area and had a son who was ages with Luke. He told me, as soon as I heard Jodi had been murdered, I knew it was Luke Mitchell. That's the problem in this case. How did he know? As soon as he heard? No evidence, no context, nothing. But as soon as he heard, he knew it was Luke Mitchell. He was the kind of person I told my son to stay away from at school. We knew it was Luke, he was just very clever and we couldn't prove it or had a very hard time trying to prove it. Yeah, maybe that's because there was no evidence. Maybe that's because he, like so many of his colleagues, jumped to a conclusion, convinced the evidence would back them up retrospectively, and it didn't, because it wasn't there. Robert Green's the Da Vinci rapist killed Jodi. Robert Green's, we discovered after the attack on the lady in Rosalind, which is just up the road from here, had very close connections to the area where Jodi was found. So we asked the police, was he involved in the original investigation? Was he checked out? And they wouldn't answer that question. I've never suggested Robert Green's had anything to do with it. My question was, did anybody go check out his movements that day? Because we had since found out that he was very close to the path that afternoon, visiting someone. So did they talk to him? That was all we wanted to know, and they wouldn't answer that question. Why didn't Luke show emotion? Well, it depends when you mean. If you're talking about when the body was found, he did. And Jodi's sister and her boyfriend both told the police that. His sister said, I knew from the concern in his voice that it was something bad. He looked like he was in shock. The boyfriend said everybody was in hysterics. So he did. And the police knew that. If you're talking about why didn't he show emotion in court, I've said this before, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. He was also warned to react to nothing. Nothing. So if he cried, it would have been crocodile tears. if he'd shouted and protested, he'd have been goading Jodi's family or increasing their suffering. So there was nothing he could do that would have satisfied what people think should have been the correct reactions. There is one other account of Luke's failure to show emotion, and that came from Jodi's mum, who said that when she went to visit him a couple of days after the murder and tried to hug him, he stood there like a stick of rock. When Luke was released from the police station at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, he was then heavily sedated. And he was still heavily sedated the day Jodi's mum came to visit. The whole point of sedation is to damp down the emotions because of the horrific nature of what he'd seen. So once again, he's on medication to stop these emotions coming up, but that's used against him. Edinburgh Evening News report the interview was dropped from this case in 2014. No mention of that here. Why? Paper reports state Mitchell's mother unhappy at Dr. Lean's participation. An interviewee quoted as saying reasons for no longer being involved would remain private. I stopped working on the case for a bit in 2014. That's absolutely true. I started again early 2016. When the Commission refused to refer the case back, I had no idea what else could be done. With a case as strong as we put forward, they agreed that his rights had been breached. They agreed that information had been withheld from the defence. They agreed that there were all these anomalies and mistakes and things not done that should have been done. They agreed with all of that. And still, they refused to refer it back. And I didn't know what else I could do. Emotions were running high. Obviously, it was a major blow that they refused to refer it back. But I didn't know where we could go after that. Just to give you an idea of what we were up against with the Commission. In 2006, a man came forward with information to Luke's family. He'd been trying to get this information to the defence and prior to that to the police. And what he told us was a student who had been living in Newbattle Abbey College, which is directly across the road from the end of Luke Street, had turned up the morning after the murder with a bloodshot eye, scratches to his face. He was acting in an agitated manner and couldn't remember where he'd been the night before. So that formed a ground of appeal in 2008, and the prosecution trashed it. They said there was no evidence, there were no witness statements to back up everything that was said there. Scott Forbes, who'd brought the information to Luke's family, had said that he had taken this guy to the police station. He'd told the police about him, and he'd taken him to the police station by the end of the first week of the investigation. Prosecution said at appeal, none of that happened. And finally, and this is absolutely ludicrous, the prosecution said that Mr. Forbes came up with a plan that the student would go to the police and tell them about his bloodshot eye and his scratches and not remembering where he was the night before and all of that. And when the police cleared him, they would sell the story to the newspapers for £50,000. What lunatic would accept that, would go along with that plan? That's what the prosecution used to demolish the appeal point. And that would have been the end of it. But when I got access to the case papers in 2009-10, everything that Scott Forbes had told Corinne in 2006 was in the case papers. The reports to the police, the phone calls to the police were there. The fact that the police were in Newbattle Abbey College taking names of students who were still there, and this student's name was on their list. 5 other statements supporting the fact that this guy had injuries and he was behaving strangely, that he'd been running on the New Battle Road that night. It was all there. It was all in the case papers. And they'd simply never bothered to follow it up. So fast forward again to the commission application. We found out that this student back then bore a striking resemblance to Luke, and he was known to wear a parka jacket prior to the murder, and that information was brought forward by somebody who had good reason to note that he had a parka jacket prior to the murder, because she said she was relieved that he had a warm coat. So here's a guy who looks like Luke in a parka jacket on the New Battle Road the evening of the murder. The two eyewitnesses who came down the New Battle Road in a car and clocked this guy at the side of the road, who later identified him in court as Luke on the stand, even though they both said they never saw his face and they were driving past it, they'd seen him for a couple of seconds. Their identification, in view of the evidence about the student, could no longer stand. How could anybody be sure that the person they saw was Luke and not the student? And it's actually that simple. It could simply have been a case of mistaken identity. That would have taken a big chunk out of the prosecution's case that Luke was seen at the East House's end of the path, he murdered Jodi, and then he was seen at the New Battle end of the path within an hour. The commission didn't even look at the mistaken identity aspect of it. They said, this guy was never a suspect, so all of this is irrelevant. He wasn't a suspect because they didn't bother to follow up on any of the information that they had in the files. They said at the time they couldn't trace him. He lived 500 yards from the murder scene. He lived directly across the road from Luke. He was in New Battle Abbey as a student. They had his name in their files and they said they couldn't trace him. But according to the commission, he wasn't a suspect, so the information about potential mistaken identity was irrelevant. The fact that they're two completely different things was never considered. It's that this sort of false reasoning that we're up against again and again and again when we try to take this case forward. This information really needs further scrutiny. If it's nonsense, Jodi's parents have very little to lose and possibly everything to gain. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Why not name Condom Man? Is it money you want? This was the newspaper stories after the James English interview. The Evening News and The Sun both ran stories claiming that I was saying that a mystery man had deposited the condom near the crime scene. And what I was trying to do was call them out. Because both newspapers reported back in 2006 about this guy, and they reported about him by name. They named him. So what I was trying to do was show that this calling him a mystery man, it's all designed to undermine the credibility of the information. But they knew 13 years ago what the guy's name was. So it's nothing to do with money. I don't do this for money. That's nothing to do with it. I wanted them to admit publicly that they knew he wasn't a mystery man, and that approach is simply used to undermine any information that comes out about the case that questions the official line. I stayed right beside this kid and I think he clearly did it. Jodi was found behind my school. This boy was caught burning clothes the next day, so them saying they didn't cover it up, the mother did cover it up. If you know his mum and him, then you would know what I'm talking about. I've explained about the non-burning of the clothes, but it's this, if you knew them, you'd know what I'm talking about. That's the level of gossip and innuendo that's gone around this area for 16 years. That's not evidence, it's not proof of anything, it's prejudice. Pure and simple. Sandra Lean, you should be ashamed of yourself bringing this all back up again. Please don't answer back, you've said enough already. No. I decide when I've said enough. Thank you very much. The two questions that I've kept for the end, I've kept because they show this strange thing where people claiming to be supportive of Jodi's family make up lies to demonstrate that support. Now, if they're convinced that justice has been done and the right man's been convicted, why do they need to embellish stories or just make up stories to make Luke appear even guiltier than he's already been made to look? These stories feed into the swirling mass of misinformation that's already out there about the case. And as you'll see with the second one, they spill over into a deep disrespect for Jodi's family. So this first one. When Luke found the body, he actually tried to pick Jodi up and cuddled her and cried while cuddling her. So this lady is lying that Luke's DNA wasn't on her body. This is a shocking podcast and should be deleted by YouTube. That's a shocking lie. Luke did not try to pick up Jodi's body or cuddle her. There is no DNA from Jodi on Luke, period, or from him on her. It's not there. That is an absolute fact. This story about Luke cuddling Jodi or throwing himself on Jodi's body came from a local police officer who was going around telling anybody that would listen that when he got there, when the body was found, he asked Luke to show him where the body was, and Luke took him down to the body, and while they were standing there, Luke threw himself on the body and said that would account for any DNA that was later found on his clothing. When the police got there, it's true that that officer asked Luke to go over the wall and show him where the body was. The youngest member of the search party, the only child there, and Luke refused. He said, I'm not going back over there. That was later used to suggest that Luke was belligerent or cold or uncaring, when in actual fact he was a kid who didn't want to go back over that wall, seeing what he'd already seen once. So the first thing, again, begs the question, why was it Luke that was asked? 3 of them had been over the wall, and Luke was the youngest there. And I believe that supports what I've said before, that they thought it was Luke and Luke alone who found the body, and that the other 3 searchers turned up afterwards. But I digress. This cop telling people that story, he knew that Luke didn't go over the wall. Again, he knew that that didn't happen. But he's going around telling that story as if it's true, and here we find it 16 years later still being repeated. There was another side to the cuddling the body story, and that was that someone cradled Jodi's body when she was found. It was later changed to touched her forehead. But that person was Jodi's gran, not Luke. And by the time they asked the gran for her clothes, about a week later, she'd forgotten what she was wearing that night. The other thing, obviously, if Luke had thrown himself on the body or he cuddled the body, the DNA, the scene itself would have guaranteed there would have been forensic evidence on him. There is absolutely no way that could have been avoided had he tried to hold Jodi that night. He's asked how he knew he tried to pick her up and cried while cuddling her. And he says from the others that were there when they found the body, look back on all the media coverage on this, it was well documented. It wasn't because it didn't happen. The only person who ever suggested it was this police officer that was going around stirring up local gossip. But the idea that the others that were there told him that they saw Luke doing this, that's not possible. That's simply not possible. Luke went over the wall at the V-point. He went down, he saw Jodi's body 8 to 12 feet away. He got to a big tree and saw her body. Shouted that he thought there was something there. Went back up to the V-point. Kelly went over. Went to pretty much the same spot as Luke. Saw Jodi's body 8 to 12 feet away. Came back up. The two boys then helped the gran over the wall. And she was the only one of the three that went right up to the body. So there was nobody there to see what Luke did when he first went over the wall. All we know is, because there was no forensic evidence on him or of him on Jodi, he couldn't possibly have tried to hold her. You also said there was no DNA of Luke's anywhere near Joe's body. If you agree he was present, how is that possible? Because he didn't go near the body. Sandra Lean, you should be ashamed of yourself for going on YouTube to bring all this back up. Sandra, you should be careful. This is a total joke. You're a very sick person to do this. You should have all the evidence yourself before trying to hurt this family again, you sick, sick woman. I'm not the one making things up about what happened to Jodi. That's sick. This last one is along similar lines, but in many ways it's so much worse. Does anyone commenting actually hear what was said at trial? The circumstantial evidence in the first hour of her body's discovery was overwhelming. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. In the first hour, all they had was a bunch of wrong information, and they were traipsing around contaminating the crime scene. That's all they had in the first hour. Police searches of his house turned up journals on how to decapitate humans, a vast collection of weapons, bottles of his own urine left under the bed that was tested to be 6 to 8 months old, plus very detailed graphic pictures of a beheaded human girl. None of that is true. But this guy's obsession with decapitation is extremely worrying. Journals on how to decapitate humans. I'm not thinking you can go into your local W.H. Smith and pick up a copy of one of them. A vast collection of weapons. There were no weapons taken from Luke's house. Bottles of his own urine left under the bed. Now, there's an element of truth in this, but nothing like what this guy is trying to suggest. After the raid on the 4th of July, Luke started peeing in bottles and storing them. It was later diagnosed as an OCD reaction to the finding of the body being taken straight to the police station, held overnight, brought back immediately in the media eye for that point onwards, and then being raided again on the 4th of July. There were no bottles found in that raid on the 4th of July, and the police tore his house to pieces. They left nothing untouched. So that supports the suggestion that it started after the 4th of July, and that something up to that point must have triggered it. So we know why they were there. We know why he was doing it, because that was the diagnosis. But they were not 6 to 8 months old, because we know they didn't start appearing until after the 4th of July. Plus, very detailed, is obsessed with decapitation. Text records show he had arranged to meet her at around 5 p.m. that evening. No, they didn't, because the text messages were never recovered. His own mum couldn't give him an alibi for the hours of the crime. We've talked about alibi already. But there's a difficulty here, because we don't know what time the crime happened. The time of death was never confirmed. Luke had an alibi that whole evening, but the hour between 5 and 6 was when his mum and his brother were his alibi. And surprise, surprise, that's the time, or the time frame, which the police decided was going to be the time of the murder. They decided 5:15. There is not a single scrap of evidence to support the idea that Jodi was murdered at 5:15. Nothing. He said he went to the path as arranged to meet her, confirmed by eyewitnesses. Nope. There was never an arrangement for him to go to the path to meet her. That was a story that was introduced much later to try to explain why Luke would be at the East House's end of the path. Because the plan was that Jodi would walk down the path herself and meet Luke at Newbattle. So there was no arrangement to meet at the top of the path. He then claimed she did not show up and proceeded to walk up and back down said path. Well, yeah, he went up the path looking for her, and the search trio suggested a double check, and they all walked back down again. Jodi's family claimed she'd left to meet him and then reported her as a missing child to the police. The family sent out a search party which included Luke. No, I've already explained several times. Luke went out on his own. The search trio left on their own. They didn't know each other was out looking. Luke, who upon entering the wooded area was quick to discover the corpse of Jodi nearly decapitated, no signs of sexual attack, this all within a few hours of her reported missing. She was found within 40 minutes of being reported missing. Said witnesses heard an ear-piercing scream followed by what sounded like a horrible gargling noise. It's completely made up. Didn't happen. After several hours of no text messages, trying to provide himself with an alibi, again, Jodi's phone was broken, so Luke couldn't have been trying to text her. He called her house at 5:30 to find out if she was coming down or not. And then he called another friend that they were going to be hanging out with that night. And that's it. After the 5:30 call to Jodi's house, there's no further calls or text messages from Luke to any member of Jodi's family until her mum texted at nearly 20 to 11 telling Jodi to get home. Anyone who's studied human behavioural science will tell you that the person who discovers the body in circumstances like this, that this person had previous knowledge of the resting place of this human. Really? So we're saying that every time a dog walker finds a body, that dog walker must have had knowledge that the body was there. Because that's, in essence, what's being suggested here. He fits the profile set out by special agents in the FBI for eliminating suspect pools. That's an interesting one, because the police went to the FBI looking for an FBI profile that might help them identify somebody, the type of person who could have done this. It was never used at trial, and it was never released to the defence. When we managed to get a hold of it several years later, it was so heavily redacted that there was not a bit of it readable. So if you think about this, if that profile could in any way have been linked to Luke Mitchell, they would have used it. So we have to assume it didn't identify anybody, anything like Luke. But what then would be the reason for redacting it completely? And the only thing I can think of there is that it did identify someone else that the police would have known about that fitted that profile, and they didn't want anybody to know. The person must have known the victim to get her to such a secluded part with no struggle. Okay. Her two cousins were right there at the V-point. She would have known them. You see, this is the problem. This idea that Luke was the only person that she would have met on the path. Luke was the only person that she would have known on the path. Luke was the only person she would have trusted to go over the wall with. There is no evidence to support that. And there is evidence that there were other people that she knew really well that were on the path that afternoon at the time she would have been walking down it. This, for me, this is what finishes it. And I'll explain why in a minute, although you'll probably see for yourself. She had one very deep cut to her throat made with a very large, sharp knife which cut through her major arteries and almost took the whole head off. I'm just going to say two things about this. First of all, the murder weapon was never recovered. So nobody knows what was used, precisely what was used to inflict the injuries on Jodi. Secondly, this description of how Jodi was killed does not match the injuries on Jodi's body when she was found. One could even suggest that this guy has special knowledge. He probably doesn't. He probably just made it up. But that's the danger when people are making things up. He could have put himself in a position where somebody could have come to him and said, "Where did you get that information?" Because that's information nobody should know. He goes on to say, "I'm sorry for any of Jodi's family that may read this and be reliving that horrible day. Sorry." All of this just made up. The truth just thrown aside and all of this made up. The continual references to horrific injuries. Everybody knows what happened to Jodi. It does not need this repetition. And this guy claims I'm the one putting Jodi's family through unnecessary pain. It's just, I have no words. All because some woman needs to make a few bucks off other people's suffering, bringing her family joy while not caring how many people are hurt in the process. The profits from the book are going to fund a new organisation that hopefully will be able to look at cases like this and push for re-examination and push for case review. There are over 300 pieces of forensic evidence linking him to the crime. Are there? And they didn't use them at trial? Trial minutes are available on public record. They are, yeah, go. Anybody that feels so inclined, go have a look at them and see if you can find the 300 pieces of forensic evidence. They're not there. It was a no-brainer. The only reason the jury took too long to deliver was a contemplation of whether it was a premeditated attack or a spur-of-the-moment attack. The only reason it took the jury too long to deliver. Too long. How long's too long? This was the longest trial of a single accused in Scottish history. I think it was 49 days. The jury returned their verdict after less than 5 hours deliberation. Less than 5 hours. That's all it took them. So the idea that it took them too long, is he suggesting that the minute the case ended, they should have just stood up and said guilty? Anyway, that's the questions that have come up so far. I have no doubt there will be more, so if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I will get back to them and answer them when I can. This video is being put out in conjunction with the launch of the organisation I was talking about earlier, Long Road to Justice. If you have a look at the website, you can see there's a number of things that we're hoping to do to try and get this information into the public domain, not just about this case, but about justice in Scotland in general, because we need to be confident that we're convicting the right people and we're doing that with proper evidence. Because if we don't, we're running the risk of not only putting innocent people away for a very long time, but also of leaving dangerous attackers out here in the community walking among us. And that means tomorrow's victim could be somebody you love, somebody I love, and that's not justice. That's not justice. So it's time now to stand up and make it accountable. Thanks for listening.